Subscribe to Echo Tales for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Rachel sat curled on the living room sofa, the soft glow of the fireplace flickering against the walls, a half-full glass of red wine in her hand. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, like memories frozen in time. It had been almost a year since her husband Mark passed away, but the house still clung to him, his favorite chair by the window, the old piano he used to play on rainy days, even the low creak in the floorboards that once signaled his footsteps. But tonight wasn't about Mark. It was about David, Mark's son, her stepson. David had come to visit for the weekend, his first visit since the funeral. He had stayed away, understandably. Grief had its own strange ways of keeping people apart. But when he messaged her a few days ago, just a short, polite note saying he'd like to come by, Rachel had felt something stir in her. A mixture of nerves, anticipation, and a strange, quiet ache. She hadn't seen him in almost a year. The last time she had, they were both dressed in black, standing side by side at the gravesite, saying goodbye to the same man, but from different corners of their hearts. David was 28 now, older, stronger, no longer the boy she used to cook for or gently scold for leaving his shoes by the door. Time had carved maturity into his face, and life had added shadows behind his eyes. Rachel wondered if he still smiled, the same. She wondered if he blamed her. If not with words, then in silence. The hours passed slowly. She wasn't sure if he had fallen asleep in the guest room or was still awake, thinking like she was. She took another sip of wine and leaned back, eyes tracing the crackling fire, remembering the laughter that once filled this house. Then, the soft sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned, and there he was. David stood in the doorway of the living room, his broad shoulders leaning slightly against the frame, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was tousled, his face tired, but his presence was solid, grounding. There was something about the way he looked at her, not with distance or coldness, but with something quieter. Sadness, maybe, or tenderness. "Couldn't sleep?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "Too many memories," he said. She nodded. She understood that too well. With a small, nervous smile, she patted the spot on the sofa next to her. "Same here," she murmured. He walked over and sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. The silence between them was not awkward. It was full of unspoken things, buried emotions, and the mutual understanding of two people who had both loved and lost the same man in different ways. Rachel held up the glass of wine, offering it gently. "Want some?" she asked. David hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed, and in that tiny, accidental moment of contact, something electric passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but human, real, honest. He took a sip and handed it back, his eyes still on hers. Neither of them said a word. The fire crackled. The rain tapped lightly against the windows. And in the quiet warmth of the room, with grief sitting silently between them, something unexpected began to shift. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the beginning of something neither of them could name, and neither dared to speak aloud. Not now, not tonight, but soon. Very soon. The morning light slipped gently through the kitchen curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the countertop as Rachel moved about, quietly preparing breakfast. Her hands worked almost automatically, buttering toast, slicing strawberries, scrambling eggs. But her mind was elsewhere. She hadn't felt this kind of nervous energy in years. It was a strange mix of comfort and tension, of familiarity and unfamiliarity. David was still asleep, she assumed, though she had heard him stirring earlier upstairs. As she set 2 plates on the table, her eyes paused on the bowl of strawberries. He used to love them when he was younger. She had remembered that without even trying. How he'd pile them onto his cereal. How he'd grin when they were sweet. It struck her then, unexpectedly, how many little things she had remembered about him over the years, not just as her husband's son, but as David. His own person, his own story. And now, that story was crossing paths with hers again. And something about it felt different, deeper. When David finally came down, dressed simply in a worn gray t-shirt and jeans, he looked exactly how someone should look on a slow morning. A little sleepy, a little disheveled, but real. Rachel greeted him with a quiet smile, not wanting to make too much of anything. They talked over breakfast, light, easy things. His work, which he described with careful restraint. Her new hobby of painting, which she played down with a laugh. There was laughter, yes, but behind it all, something hovered in the air between them. An awareness. An emotional current that neither could quite ignore. After the meal, Rachel led him into the study. The room Mark had always called his sanctuary. She hadn't spent much time in there since his passing. The room still carried his scent, faint traces of his cologne, the musky scent of old books and time. Rachel opened a drawer and gently pulled out a small velvet box. Her fingers hesitated, and then, with a steady breath, she turned to David. "I've been holding on to this," she said softly, "but I think it's time you had it." She extended the box toward him. His brow furrowed slightly as he accepted it, his hands cradling it with care. When he opened it, his breath caught. Inside was his father's gold-trimmed wristwatch. It was timeless, heavy with memory, and clearly well-loved. For a long moment, David just stared at it. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. Rachel smiled, though a flicker of sadness touched her eyes. "He always said it would be yours one day. He just never said when. But I think he'd want you to have it now." David looked at her, and in that look was something raw. He reached out and touched her hand, not in passing, but with intent. His fingers closed over hers, grounding himself. The moment lasted longer than it should have, yet neither pulled away. Rachel felt the heat rush to her face, not from shame, but from the sudden closeness, the kind that made your heart ache and flutter at the same time. And then David said something that she wasn't prepared for. "Rachel, I've been dreaming about this place. About being back here. About you." His voice cracked on the last word, as if he didn't mean to say it, or maybe he did, but didn't know how to take it back. Rachel blinked. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat. She didn't answer, not with words. She didn't know what to say. The weight of the watch between them felt like more than a symbol. It felt like a handoff between the past and something new, something fragile, something dangerous. They both stood there, in that little study filled with memories, and suddenly, the air wasn't just heavy with the past. It was trembling with possibility. The day passed like a quiet melody, slow, soft, with something unspoken in the air. Rachel found herself outside in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming lavender bushes that had started to overgrow the path. She hadn't worked in the garden for months, but something about having David in the house again made her want to bring life back into the things she'd let fade. Every now and then, she looked up to find him on the porch, focused on repairing the old railing that had been loose for years. He didn't ask for tools or instructions. He just worked, sleeves rolled up, sawdust clinging to his arms. There was something grounding in the way he moved, steady, deliberate, and Rachel felt her heart beat a little differently watching him. They didn't talk much during the afternoon. Their words had run deep that morning, and now it felt like they were both silently processing everything that had shifted between them. But even in the silence, there was connection. Their glances held a new kind of weight. Their nearness, even apart, felt intimate. By early evening, the clouds had gathered above them. Rain came not in thunderous downpours, but in gentle sheets, soft and cleansing. Rachel lit a few candles in the living room, turned on the small lamp beside the piano, and wrapped herself in a knit shawl. David reappeared, hair damp, shirt clinging slightly to his chest, but his expression calm, the kind of calm that comes when something inside you has settled after a long storm. "You still have the piano," he said quietly, touching the smooth, worn keys with familiarity. Rachel nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "I could never let it go." And then, to her surprise, David sat down and began to play, a slow, familiar tune that his father used to hum while reading late at night. The notes filled the room like a memory coming back to life. Rachel closed her eyes and let it wash over her, heart heavy with emotion. That song, it belonged to another time. But somehow, it didn't feel painful anymore. It felt healing. When the last note faded, the silence between them returned. But it was different now. It was not a silence of absence, but of presence, full, waiting. David turned to her. His eyes, always so steady, were softer now. "You remember everything," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "Not everything," he replied, meeting her gaze. "Just what mattered." The way he said it, not flippantly, not with nostalgia, but with truth, made something stir in her chest. A sadness, a longing, a recognition. She looked away for a moment, afraid that if she held his eyes any longer, he might see everything she was feeling. Or worse, that he already did. She stood slowly, pretending to straighten a stack of books by the fireplace, pretending to need distance. "I should get some rest," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. But just as she turned, David rose too. He took a quiet step forward, then stopped, as if fighting a storm inside himself. "Rachel," he said gently. She froze. Her name sounded different on his lips now, older, deeper, heavier. "I miss him too," he added, his voice raw. "But sometimes I wonder if what I've been missing isn't just him. It's something I never had." She didn't ask what he meant, because she already knew. It was her, or the version of her he had tucked away in his memories, too long, too quietly. And in that moment, under the soft hum of rain, with candlelight dancing against the walls, Rachel realized they were standing at the edge of something they could no longer pretend wasn't real. The night fell slower than usual, wrapped in a hush that made every sound feel louder. The ticking of the hallway clock, the occasional creak of wood, the soft rustle of wind against the windows. Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay under her covers, staring at the ceiling, heart racing for reasons she didn't want to admit. Her mind kept circling back to David, to the way he'd looked at her earlier, the way he had spoken her name, low and full of something that trembled just beneath the surface. It wasn't what he said that haunted her most. It was what he hadn't. The words he'd swallowed, the longing buried in his tone. She threw back the covers and sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping a robe around her. She didn't plan to go to his room. She told herself she'd just check the locks, maybe get some water. But her feet led her down the hallway like they had a will of their own. She paused in front of his door, her fingers hovering just above the wood. For a moment she hesitated, her heart pounding in her ears. Then, slowly, she knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if he'd been standing just behind it. David, stood there in the soft glow of his bedside lamp, wearing nothing but a pair of sweatpants. His hair was messy, his chest bare, his expression unreadable, but open. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, and she nearly smiled. It was the same question she'd asked him just 2 nights ago. "No," she said quietly. "Too much. In my head." He stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. The room smelled like him, clean, warm, slightly earthy. She sat in the armchair by the window, while he leaned against the desk, arms folded, eyes on her like she might disappear if he blinked. They talked at first about nothing. Childhood stories. Her memories of David as a teenager, tall and awkward, always kind. He listened without interrupting, his gaze unwavering, his silence full of attention. But as the night deepened, so did their words. They began to tread into vulnerable places. Their grief, their loneliness, how empty the world had felt since Mark died. And underneath it all, the things they didn't quite say. The comfort they found in each other now. The strange closeness that had grown between them like vines, slow and steady. At one point, Rachel stood to stretch, walking over to the window, to peer into the darkness. David moved too, stepping behind her. She felt him close, not touching, but near enough that the space between them ached. She could see their reflections in the glass. Her, still, uncertain. Him, behind her, steady and waiting. When she turned around, their eyes met, and the moment shifted. The air changed. It became heavier, slower, filled with a kind of tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with longing. David didn't move. He didn't touch her, but his gaze said more than words could have. Rachel's breath hitched. "I should go," she whispered, and her voice didn't sound like her own. She took a step back, but he caught her hand, not hard, not forceful, just enough to stop her. His thumb brushed over hers, slow and gentle, and for a second, time stopped. The silence between them stretched, tender and charged. She didn't pull away. She didn't move closer either. It was a single dangerous moment, and yet it was softer than anything she had felt in years. Finally, she slipped, her hand free, and left the room, her heart pounding in her chest like a secret she didn't know how to keep. The next morning arrived with a kind of fragile stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath. Rachel moved through the kitchen slower than usual, as if each step required thought. She hadn't slept much, her dreams tangled with fragments of the night before. David's voice, the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his fingers brushing hers. It wasn't just the moment that haunted her. It was what it awakened. Feelings she had never expected to feel again. Not just longing, but something deeper. Something dangerous. She couldn't name it, but it had settled in her chest like a quiet fire. She kept her eyes low as she heard his footsteps approach. David entered the room with a calm energy, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those storm-colored eyes, flickered briefly toward her, and she felt her stomach twist. "Morning," he said softly. She gave a small nod. "Coffee's fresh." They danced around conversation the way people do when too much has been said in silence. Every movement between them felt measured now, as if they were both afraid of tipping something over. Eventually, he took his coffee and sat by the window, and Rachel joined him a few moments later, the space between them quiet but full. They talked about his upcoming trip back to the city, just 2 days away now. Rachel felt a strange ache when he mentioned it, one she didn't expect. It made everything feel temporary, as though whatever thread had been weaving between them might snap the moment he left. "You've been good for this house," she said softly, surprising even herself. David looked at her, his face thoughtful. "You've been good for me," he replied. There was no teasing in his tone, only truth. She looked down quickly, not sure what to say. Her fingers wrapped around her mug like it could steady her. "I keep thinking about how we got here," she whispered. "Not just this moment, but everything. You were just a boy when I met you." He nodded slowly, his voice low. "And you were the woman I looked up to more than anyone else. You still are." That sentence changed something between them. It wasn't romantic, not overtly, but it was intimate, laced with admiration, affection, maybe even a quiet kind of love. The kind that grows in the background, unnoticed, until one day it's too large to ignore. Rachel stood, suddenly needing air. She stepped out onto the porch, the cool breeze brushing her face, calming her. A few moments later, she heard him follow. She didn't turn around. "Do you regret last night?" he asked. The question was simple, but it cracked the air between them. She closed her eyes. "I don't know what I feel," she said honestly. "I don't know what's right or wrong anymore, but I know I feel something, and that's what scares me." He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the pull of him. "You don't have to be scared," he said, voice low. "Whatever this is, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." She finally turned to face him, and the look in his eyes nearly undid her. It wasn't lust or confusion. It was care, real, patient care, the kind that doesn't demand, the kind that waits. Rachel didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't rejection. It was caution, mixed with a storm of emotions she was still sorting through. But her eyes, glistening with something between grief and longing, said it all. They stood there, barely a foot apart, two hearts beating too loudly in the stillness of morning. And somewhere in the quiet, a choice was forming, slow, fragile, but inevitable. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the floorboards of the quiet house. It was David's last night. The stillness was heavier now, not because of silence, but because both of them knew, without saying it, that something would end tomorrow. Or maybe something had already begun, and the thought of leaving it, unfinished, made the walls feel too close. Rachel stood in the study, her fingers grazing the bookshelf where Mark's old journals still sat untouched. She wasn't crying, but her chest ached in that familiar way. The ache of letting go, and maybe of letting something else in. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the door, and then footsteps. David didn't speak. He just walked to where she stood, stopping just behind her, not touching, but close enough that his presence felt like warmth. She turned slowly to face him, and they simply looked at each other for a long time, not with expectation, but with understanding. They had lived with so much unsaid. Now, words felt unnecessary. "I was going to leave early," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think if I leave without saying what's in my heart, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Rachel didn't speak. Her heart thudded softly in her chest, waiting. "I've felt alone for a long time," he continued, "even when I was surrounded by people. But when I came here, when I was with you, I didn't feel that anymore." He paused, stepping closer now. "I know it's complicated. I know how this looks, how it sounds. But I also know that what I feel for you, it's real. It's not just about grief or memory. It's you, Rachel. It's the way you speak, the way you care, the way you see the world. I never saw you as my father's wife. I saw you as you, and I care about you more than I probably should." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Not from shock, but from the quiet truth of it. She had known. She had felt it too. The slow, undeniable shift between them. But hearing it aloud made it all the more real and frightening. "David," she began, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to cross any lines. I still don't. You're so young, and Her voice trailed off. She couldn't lie. Not to him. Not to herself. "I think I've been hiding behind rules. Behind what people would think. Because the truth is, I feel something for you too. And it scares me." A pause lingered in the room, tender and taut, filled with everything they had both been holding back. Then David reached forward, gently brushing away a tear from her cheek. "It doesn't have to be today. It doesn't have to be anything right now," he said. "But please don't pretend it's not there." And she didn't. Instead, she leaned forward and rested her head lightly against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It felt safe there, not because it was simple, but because it was honest. They stood like that for a long while, holding a moment neither of them quite knew what to name. And when she finally pulled back, she gave him the faintest smile, one touched by sadness but also something else, hope. "Stay one more day," she whispered. He nodded. No promises, no rushed declarations. Just presence. Just a beginning. Outside, the stars appeared one by one, quiet and brilliant. And inside, in the quiet house that once belonged to grief, two hearts had finally found each other. Not in perfection, but in the quiet beauty of something real.